Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to be here chatting to the Society. If I just bring up to tell you my background, my father was military. One of his postings was to Malaya in 1957, towards the end of the Malayan emergency. And I went to school in Upland School, Penang. That's up on top of the hill. I was not a studious pupil. The jungle was far more important than attending classes and things of that nature. And that came out in my reports. And my father then got hold of me a few turns later and said, "Right, Johnny, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And I said, "I want to be Tarzan." Well, that went down like a lead balloon. And before I knew it, I was back in the UK, attending school at Victoria College, Jersey. But what I didn't know, nor did my father, that 10 years later, I would be a lieutenant in the Royal New Zealand Artillery as a forward observer in Vietnam, embedded and supporting Australian troops. And so the jungle caught up. In 65, I joined the New Zealand Army. Vietnam, 68, 69. 11 of the 12 months were spent on operations, basically in the jungle. In 73, I transferred to the British Army, Northern Ireland tours, seconded to the Sultanate of Oman, where I had to learn Arabic before I went there. And then the Falklands in 82, this was the second tranche, I've got to say. And in 1994, I was sent to go and instruct at the Jungle Warfare School in Brunei, because my boss, a brigadier, looked at my background, Vietnam jungle, I am a New Zealand jungle WI, etc. And so for 2 or 3 years, 2 or 3 times a year for the next 21 years, I was going to Brunei. Fantastic, far better than any office, I can tell you. In 99, Victoria and our 2 children joined me, and then we came to Sabah. And that's when we went into Sandakan, and we went to visit. We saw the Memorial Park. I knew nothing about it. Read it, and I was absolutely horrified of what I read. Obviously, very Australian orientated, but I went back and started looking into it. People didn't know back in the UK. A lot of people didn't even know where Borneo was. And then the horrible truth came out that though the Australians were far greater numbers, we were a third of their numbers, half of the British numbers were from my regiment, the Royal Artillery, and none of them survived. And so that is the story. It's a story that has got to be told. And that is what the start of the Borneo graveyard, 41, 45. The Japanese, as we know, Pearl Harbor, then Northern Malaya in 8th December 41, the start of the invasion of Borneo on the 16th of December 41 and 10th of January 42, the Japanese then started invading Sumatra, the Netherlands, East Indies. The invasion of Borneo, 41-45, initially was at Miri in Sarawak, Suria, and Kuala Belait in Brunei. And their landing was in very heavy weather. In fact, it was described as crazy weather to have done any form of landing. And they lost a lot of men in that process. On the 24th of December, a force of 6,000 started their assault onto Kuching. And On that day, the battle with 2nd 15th Punjab Regiment, led by Colonel Lane, and it occurred at the Bukit Staba Aerodrome, which basically is Sandakan International Airport as we know it now. There had been fighting along the river, but this is where the big battle started, and Kuching was declared a safe city. In other words, no fighting was going to occur in it. The Japanese suffered. They suffered 384 killed and between 1,100 and 1,800 wounded in the battle for that airfield. They withdrew, licked their wounds, and then and in the meantime, night came, and Lane said, "We're getting out. We can't fight a force this size." And so what occurred that night, he left half a company as a false front, and the remainder of the battalion started their withdrawal out of Sarawak. Ahead of them were the women and children of the Raja Brooks, of those that wanted to go, and the wounded from Kuching Hospital, led by a small group of Punjab Regiment. And they went down to Pontianak, and they got there. Amazingly, they got a vessel, and they escaped. The Japanese arrived 2 days later. As for the 2nd 15th Punjab, they started their 800-mile fighting withdrawal. Well, this is the thing about technology sometimes. They started their withdrawal 800 miles through the jungle. They fought all the way, and when they got down to Panglaboan, and that's the error, that should be the 3rd of April, the CO looked at his regiment. From a regiment that was close to 1,000 men, he had 400 left. They were in terrible state. They had hardly any ammunition, and they were starving. They'd had no food, and said, "We are going to surrender." They were met by Japanese Marines. And so they went into captivity. By the 10th of February, the Japanese had secured the whole of Borneo. It was an extraordinary act. And Borneo was Japanese. Over in, we then had Sumatra, the Battle of Palembang. Here, and that was fought by British gunners and RAF ground troops. The Dutch forces had actually already left. And what is at Palembang? Oil refineries. After a day or two of fighting, they were air defense gunners. They withdrew down to Oosthaven at a great rate, by any means. They commandeered a train, actually driven by 2 Americans. Where they came from, I'm not sure. But they just carried on. And when they got their taxis, and when they got down here, the guns that had got down, they had to spike. In other words, they can't ever be used, and thrown over the wharf. And they escaped across to Batavia. Singapore had surrendered. On the 1st of March, 42, was the Battle of Kalajati. And the Battle of Kalajati is the most bloody air defense battle that the Royal Artillery fought, I believe, have ever fought. In 2.5 hours, they'd lost 103 men. The RAF 29 out of 30, and the Australian Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force, lost 43. Many of them killed in the battle. The remainder of those were executed on the spot. On the 8th of March was the surrender of the Dutch East Indies. And where was it done? At Kalajati. And what was lying around was the detritus of the Battle of Kalajati. In other words, when the Dutch went and signed the paper, they could see the bodies all lying around, beheaded, burnt, some wired up with barbed wire, etc. The following day, British forces surrendered. And they went into captivity. Very briefly, the captivity in Java was pretty awful. To give an example, 200 British and Dutch troops disappeared into the mountains of Java to fight. And what happened? They were rounded up very quickly indeed, stuck into pig baskets, paraded around on trucks, and then taken out into the Java Sea, thrown overboard, this surreptitious machine gunning, and you leave it up to the sharks and drowning. There were 8 very brave Dutch women who at one of the British camps were passing food, especially fruit, through the wire to the British POWs. The Japanese guards were getting a bit annoyed, to say the least. The British prisoners were saying, "Stop it! These are not nice people." And they carried on, and they were caught, brought into camp. The whole of all the inmates were then formed into a semicircle, and the 8 women were gang raped by the guards, with the senior British officer walking behind saying, "Gentlemen, remember this, remember this." And as one person reported after the war, writing down, saying, "I didn't have to remember it, it was burnt in my brain." And another thing was the submarine. Out of Celebon, 90 Dutch women and children were loaded on top of the deck plates, and they were told they were being taken out to a vessel in the Java Sea where they would be put on board. Out of sight of land, the submarine submerged. One Dutch woman survived, and purely because a Javanese fisherman saw what happened, was able to save her life. And that is how we know what actually happened there. On the 23rd of September, the Java Party, there were many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I call it the Java Party because it's the party that went to Borneo. Composed of gunners, Royal Artillery, and RAF. And they sail to Singapore. And when they arrive, they've got the 17-mile walk to Keppel Harbour, from Keppel Harbour to Changi. They arrive at Changi, greeted by Malaya Command, brass, brigadiers, etc., and said, "Your marching is awful. Your dress is diabolical. You're a disgrace to your uniform. You're a mob." Well, if you want to really annoy a group of soldiers to such an extent that they take pride in being called a mob, they became known as the Java mob. And so in Changi, they walked around and said, "Who are you?" "Oh, part of the Java mob." And that was great. And what equally annoyed Malaya Command, they said, "Changi is a holiday camp. You have no idea what went on." Meantime, 15th, 18th July, the Australians have arrived at Sandakan, there to build the aerodrome, and that was B Force. 9th of October, Java Party and the Russell Party, named after Colonel Russell, arrive at Kuching. But prior to arriving at Kuching, in the Kuching reaches, 30 members of the Java Party are taken off board onto an island and massacred. Now, I have tried to work out, research why such an action took place. As far as I'm concerned, that particular senior Japanese officer on board said, these white coolies are not going to be strong enough to do any sort of decent hard work. Why do we feed them? Get rid of them. After Russell and his party got off, they then sailed to Jesselton, here, Kota Kinabalu, the 3-mile walk, and that took them to Batu Tiga Jail POW camp. The camp size is 1 acre. It's got accommodation for, designed for 40 local prisoners. In here is put 836 prisoners, POWs, of which half of them are out in the open. The other are in the 4 atap houses that the Japanese had built. It was on a slope, and at the top of the slope, the slight slope, were the latrines for 40 men, prisoners, local prisoners. We're now talking about 836 using those latrines. They fill up. You then get this brown avalanche of sewage moving down through. Dysentery went up. Over half of them went down with dysentery. And the Japanese were getting highly concerned when it went past their main gate. Now, I show here the temple, the Sikh temple, and it's an extraordinary story. And that actually, I presented a picture of that to the Sikh community. It was painted by a gunner officer, a prisoner there, he made use of bits and pieces to make paint. And he was a very good artist. But when the prisoners came back from the aerodrome, and they were in the camp, a very brave Sikh, and I do have his name, and I can never remember it, I'm sorry, Bhai Khan Singh Balwala, would start playing the Sikh holy music. And in there, he would play God Save the King, the national anthem. The prisoners, hearing this, would then stand to attention in any direction with a confused Japanese guard saying, what on earth is going on? Mad dogs of Englishmen. If they knew the full words of that particular song, then they would not have been impressed. But even more extraordinary, here you may see it says 1926, the archway. Every now and again, an elderly Sikh Babu would go there, and when it was being played, he would then stand there facing the prisoners and salute. And that's an extraordinary act of bravery. In April 43, the Japanese considered cholera was going to break out. And so the first group of 200 were moved to Sandakan by vessel, being towed by barges all the way around. And then a couple of weeks later, the remainder were moved, and the remainder were very weak indeed. 51 prisoners died here at Batu Tiga. And so they arrived at Sandakan. On the left was the Australian camp and the British POW camp on the right. The British camp was actually the Forestry Commission Research Centre. The day before our guys moved in, Javanese ramusha had moved out, and the place was in a filthy state. There was no cooking ability. There were no latrines. There was a stream nearby, which the Javanese used the ramusha used as their latrines, and so water was collected off the roofs from the stream, and they dug 3 wells, and 15 feet down, they found brackish water. and obviously all had to be boiled. But the great thing about it was 8 acres, not 1 acre. It was 8 acres. It was on a hill, and they had fresh air, and their rate of disease and problems went downhill dramatically. But the two sides were kept apart. And the only way they could talk to each other was by dead letter drops. And in an extraordinary story, once Lionel Matthews and all that occurred in the Australian camp, and the camp was locked up, dead letters stopped. They're a small group, 5 RAF said, we've got to find out. And so they drew straws, and Les Mockridge, RAF, said he drew the long or the short straw to get to the Australian hospital. So he ate uncooked rice and then started drinking lots of water. And of course his stomach swelled, and he was taken over there in great agony, followed by a friend of his. And as he lay there, beginning to explain to an Australian doctor, and in came the Japanese doctor, prodded him in the stomach. He obviously got the right action, scream, and said, oh, appendicitis, bad. And so he was sent down to Sandakan Hospital, and his totally fine appendix was taken out. He actually ended up in Kuching and survived. In August 43, 31 officers, British officers, were sent to Kuching. And it's because of those 31 and Mockridge, because he goes later, we know what happened in Sandakan in the British camp up until then. After that, we knew nothing. In October, 140 Australians were sent over, and the Japanese were trying to destroy the cohesion of the officer senior NCO strength. And then in 44, June 44, 100 UK prisoners were sent to Labuan, and they became known as the Labuan 300 when joined by the Kuching, Batu Lintang lot. Batu Lintang, it was a large camp. It had been built for 2nd and 15th Punjab by Raja Brooks. And over 4,000 POWs and internees, men, women, children. Australians, the British POWs were the greatest number, Indians and Dutch. And then there's the internees, including nurses, Bishop Hollis, and a whole lot of others. And these pictures were taken by an Australian aircraft, and on the right, the actual picture on the day that Batu Lintang was relieved. And August 44, 200 UK prisoners are transferred to Labuan. We now have the Labuan 300. Maltreatment. We all know about the maltreatment that occurs, and it's in books, it's in films and all sorts of things. The two I want to mention is slapping. Films always show Japanese soldiers and officers slapping Japanese soldiers and officers slapping prisoners, and on the side of the face, and if you've lost a lot of weight, a slap on the side of the face, it is very painful, but secondly, you go flying and you land on the ground, and then there'll be several others standing around, they'll go and give you a good kicking. Well, that's fine. The other slap is very more deliberate. It's over the ear, and that destroys your eardrum, so you are deaf. And Weary Dunlop, who was an iconic Australian doctor in Java, he recorded in his diary that in 1 month he had 34 cases of POWs coming in with burst eardrums. And in the Australian camp at Sandakan, they'd actually got one of the guards had got a bit of rattan and tapped it in one of the prisoner's ears, destroying his hearing. Then there's the cage. In Sandakan, there's the cage in the Australian side. We do not know if the British camp had a cage at all. We don't know what happened in there. But the cage was designed for a single person. You couldn't stand up, you couldn't lie down. It was open to the elements. And when you got, and you were taken out 1 hour every day for exercise, and exercise was generally a good kicking. Private Anir, Australian, spent 44 days in a cage, and when he came out a couple of days later, he actually died. And they built a larger cage for up to 15 men. But in Batu Lintang, they had what was known as the dog kennel. And as opposed to here, wooden bamboo, rattan, they had barbed wire, and barbed wire at the bottom. And it was a thoroughly nasty, unpleasant thing. Bishop Hollis was put in there for 5 days. He spent 5 days in there, over 60-year-old bishop. And when he came out, the delightful Colonel Sugar had him in his office and said, "You're not a holy man, I'm defrocking you. You are no longer a bishop." Which when that went round the camp and everywhere, people found that sort of statement extraordinary. Hollis carried on. And Captain Sakan, who was the Indian medical officer of 15th Punjab, he was in it for 6 months in the cage because he kept on saluting every senior British officer or Australian officer. And the Japanese said, "Right, the cage." And when he came out, the first thing he did was start saluting officers. And they said, "We give up." And right to the end of the war, that's what he did. And he went on and lived a grand life doctrine. And then there's the diseases and illnesses. Beriberi. And when I talked to the military about it, they said beriberi, the best, and indeed schools, and said one of the best way to understand beriberi, if you're a child, get your father's Wellington boots, put them on, and then go and fill them up with water. And then start walking and see how far you can walk, because that is what your legs fill up with water. And in one prisoner, he died, they took out 8 pints of water out of a single leg. That is what's recorded. And when the people were walking along the track, many of them suffered from beriberi. Java balls, not a very nice subject when ladies are here present, but what occurred, the testicles would blow up to larger than oranges and were very painful and a lot. And the doctors worked out, you need sun. And so they'd lie on the ground, legs apart, exposing themselves to the sun. And someone very brightly said, well, as the sun is up there, why don't we do that towards Tokyo and where the emperor is? So that is what they did. They would lie there, exposing themselves to where the emperor was, until one Japanese officer worked it out and forbid it. And a lot of it was all due to vitamin deficiency. The British Army marches on Marmite. I certainly do. B3, and that would have saved so many of the things that I show there. And the two photographs are actually from Batu Lintang. Those are the mild photographs I've got. I've seen, one of which you can actually see through a person's leg. Malnutrition and starvation and rice rations. Believe it or not, the Japanese soldiers got 800 grams of rice a day. I don't know, personally, I don't know how you eat that amount, but that is what they had. And that was quality rice. The POWs had the awful rice. 250 grams, and what they did, they cut that in half, that's the POWs, and then they hid it, because they knew there would be a bad time. And if there was a bombing, it would be reduced. And so we can see going down to 70, 50. And then by the end, the 31st of December, there was no rice at all. Added to the rice was, they may be lucky to get a bit of meat the size of an OXO cube, fish heads, generally rotting, or fish tails. And then towards the end, it was snails, rats, whatever you could get hold of. 1st of January came the order, kill the prisoners. Now that came from Japanese High Command. It was not just for Borneo, for Sandakan, or Batu Lintang. That was everywhere. And a general that I knew, he was a young lad, 11-year-old, in one of the Filipino camps. And he said, yes, I remember the Americans arrived the day before we were all going to be killed. My mother, myself, and my siblings, and everyone else. However, so this started, and one of the things put to it, why did the rice suddenly run out the day before? And so the Sandakan Death March, the route was cut, and I'm sure you know, by local tribesmen through here, and they believed they were cutting a route, a rentis, for the IJA. For them to go by vessel, they were going to get torpedoed or shot up. So they had to do their movement across British North Borneo or Sarawak or Kalimantan by rentices. And so this was cut deliberately. And this, of course, then wasn't palm oil, it was boggy, marshy ground. Then you start climbing. And when you go to the other side of a hill, you don't go like that over it, you go around it, you contour. That's the sensible thing. But no, the local tribes, they cut it to go over because it was for the Japanese. Little did they know that actually the prisoners were going to have to use it. I point to that. That is the Tankal crossing, which is just off there, where 33 on the 2nd March were executed. This is Paganantan here, where one of the most appalling things occurred. Kampai and a sampan came up, the POWs on the march, 2nd March. They looked around to see who had the most flesh, executed them killed them on the spot, and then butchered them for fresh meat. It's the only way to describe it. When I heard that story, actually the person who told me that was Sevi Chararuks up in Kundasang. Datuk Irene was standing there saying, Sevi, stop that, that's horrible stories. And then he started giving other stories. I then heard it from other places, exactly the same, and then from a British, he became a very good friend of ours, a colonel in the medical corps who had come up river in the 60s on adventure training, and he had heard exactly the same story. So there is that truth. They did commit anyway. We know that cannibalism. They crossed 30, at least 34 rivers. That actually happens to be me crossing the river. I was wearing the best of gear possible. The thing is, they were in bare feet, loincloths, carrying stuff, a third of their weight, some of them half the weight, with all the diseases and all the rest of it. I think I was pretty fit, but when I was doing that, I was thinking, how on earth did these men do that and get to the front? They must have been incredibly hard. And so the marches themselves, the first group, 455 Australians and 100 British POWs departed, following in 9 groups, following where the killing squads groups. You fell out, you're killed. You're shot, decapitated, strangled, and in fact, in the first bit, even drowned in the bogs. And it was a 29% mortality rate. Interesting figure. So a lot of them actually got to the far end, and they were the fittest. The second group, and there were some escapees, a few, but they were either killed by the Japanese or they perished in the jungle. The second group, in groups, theirs was a terrible thing. They were weak, and it was 66 mortality rate. 2 Australians were able to escape. And when they arrived, the second group arrived at Ranau 2, which is known as the last camp, or as the POWs called it, the death camp. They said, where are they? Where are all the blokes? And they said, they are exterminating us. And those are the exact words, and why I can repeat that is what they said in front of the 4 Australians that escaped in the final stages of the war from Ranau 2. The other appalling thing, of course, they came across their mates as they were walking along. The third group, majority British POWs, it was 100, they got at mile 30, and it was 100% mortality, leaving 213 POWs behind to be executed, massacred, or just die. The day after, the Japanese burnt down all the accommodation at Sandakan. They said, we're going to build you new huts, because these are horrible huts. They were never built. They had to, some of the actual huts, they had to hide from the sun under bushes or where have you. And this here is Ranau second camp. Commandant's house was up here. 2nd of July, the Royal Artillery officer was crucified. I never mention in the book I do, but in general talks, I do not mention his name because my fear is that there may be a relative that hears that particular information. And what they did was absolutely appalling. 15th of August, the last POW in Sandakan in Australia was killed, executed. And on the 27th of August, 12 days after the end of the war, 10 other ranks and 5 officers, Australian and Brit, were executed 12 days after the end of the war. As a matter of interest, I've been down there several times, and it's one thing I've always noticed: you don't get birds. There's no birdsong. And the last time I went down there, I thought, I'm going to try something. I'm going to see if I can get an echo. So I started doing the Australian cooey, or should I say the Anzac, because New Zealanders will say we do cooey as well, Australasian. And eventually, and my Tamiao Kong's 4 guides were sitting there sort of eyeing me rather strangely, and eventually I got it, cooey, got it. So I then yelled, "You're going home." And even as I say it, my hairs go on end. And I shouted that out, and back it came, "Going home." And I did it again, back it came. The guides were now standing up and said, "Major John, I think we go now, yes?" And so that is when I left, and I've never been back there again. And I'd like to think that possibly if the spirits of those there have gone home. The Japanese withdrawal. Just quickly dealing with this one, I found, and I was searching the net and digging around in American stuff and came across MacArthur's briefing notes. And I tried to get back onto the net later on, and suddenly it had disappeared. But he had here marked these various withdrawal routes of the Japanese. And I could give no figures on that from the Indonesians or anywhere else, the number that died. But over here, from Tawau to Jesselton, between 6,000 to 8,000 died. And it was the locals. The guides would take them into the jungle, said, "Yes, we can stay here for the night." The guide would then disappear off. These guys had no idea at all. And so they starved to death in the jungles. They arrived, one group of 200 arrived at a kampong. Tamiao Kong took me there. I met people and said, "Oh yes, what happened here?" They arrived starving. They wanted food. So we fed them yam or tapioca, fed raw. And so they ate that and said, "Oh, you must drink lots of water." So they drank lots of water. Their stomach expanded, yes, and exploded, and they died. Another, funny enough, it's always 200. Another group arrived, and the stuff that is put into the rivers to stun or kill fish, they then came up. They put that into the food. The Japanese fell asleep, and the kampong then practiced what they've always done for hundreds of years in Borneo, headhunting, but they were asleep ones. There is another kampong where I stopped. There's an old lady there, and she would not talk to me. She spoke very briefly to Tam. He said no, and to Beverly. Said, "No, we won't talk." And I said, "But what's that open area there? Why isn't the kampong?" And all it was, ghosts, no talk. And loads of Japanese seemingly are buried there, and the locals will not build on it because they say there are the ghosts. Liberation of Borneo. If one talked about Z-Force, one would be here all evening. But Z-Force was both in Sabah, British North Borneo, and in Sarawak. And of course, the key figure here was Gort Chester, who is buried up here in the Christian cemetery. The oboe operations, which occurred here, and then up on Brunei Bay and on Labuan itself. But thankfully, K-Force, Kuching Force, arrived at Kuching on the 11th of September, 1945. And they arrived just in time they'd arrived on the 15th. This was Colonel Sugar's order. This has obviously been paraphrased. It was signed by Dr. Marcus Clark, an Australian doctor who was an internee. He went into Sugar's office, scurried around, came up with this bit of paper. One of the Japanese captains in a folder had a copy of it. And as you can see, this is how he was going to get rid of everyone, kill the prisoners, which goes to my comment about the general when he was a youngster in the Philippines. It was no different. The Australians were horrified by the condition, absolutely appalled. The worst were sent into Kuching Hospital, and the others were moved by all means to Labuan, where they had two military hospitals they'd set up and a civilian hospital. And the letters from and the diaries of the British POWs was incredible reading. The Australians were fantastic. The tucker is great. And one is my first night, I was invited to the officers' mess, and I had my first gin and tonic in 3.5 years. Oh, it was lovely. And I had two. I had three, and I don't remember much more. So the Australians looked after them. They fed them medically. They had tea parties on the beach. They filled up. They put on weight. They tanned, and they looked like back to being human beings. Apart from, they could never get rid of what was in the head. And the Ranchi is the famous one. And when they went, Australians as well, when they went to the UK, they were given the Order of Silence. And I have a copy here, if anyone wants to read it. But basically, every prisoner was given that. You will not talk to your parents, your friends, relatives, press about what is going on. And when you arrive, you will be not questioned, but interrogated. The word is there, by people to know. And what they were looking for, is there anyone that you can say worked with the Japanese or something like that? Absolutely appalling. And you have Fusilier Howarth's words, we're the only people who understand us were ourselves. And you've then got Hilda Bates and our Babu, our friends. It was a shocking state. And when they arrived in an echo chamber of silence. People, the Second World War had been won. They're not interested in what happened out here. What they saw, these POWs, brown, well built and all the rest of it. Oh, what have you done in your, as in the prison? Oh, well, you had a bloody nice time, haven't you? And the stories are actually shocking. And there's one, yes. We attend, Victoria and I attend a meeting twice a year up in the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. And we were privileged to listen to Dr. Carmel, and he wrote a report in 1977, and he dealing with the FIPOs. 46% suffered from significant medical problems and active psychiatric problems. One of the women, she is a widow, her husband committed suicide. The chief, Roger Brooks, chief secretary, brilliant brain, 3 hard disks, and his memory was incredible. Plus, he went to my school in Jersey, which actually all helped for that. But he couldn't live with it, and he committed suicide, as did many. And my uncle, well, again, there were all sorts of problems. The British POW deaths, I'll just take two. I've talked about the others. Kuching, 587 plus. I say plus UK prisoners because there's about 200 that are not accounted for. The civilian side, 16% of the British North Borneo population died, that's the official, at the hands during the Japanese occupation. In other words, 49,000, which is appalling. Double Tenth Uprising, Albert Koch, there's 5,000. The Javanese between 3,000 and 7,000. But and then there's what was occurring inside the kampongs, inside the interior, and it was occurring all over. But just two, Lower Kulu, who's ever heard of that? 585 Dutch men, women, and children down a 600-foot mining well, mine shaft. Children first, then the women, and then the men. And Mandor, here, the Japanese say, oh, we only killed no more than 2,000. An American reporter reckons it was 20,000. I've read the report by a Japanese warrant officer, and he said, all I know, I took up 500 odd local people in trucks to Mandor, and they got off and they were taken away. I don't know anything more. I didn't kill any people. If that's one truckload, then I think somewhere in between those figures we're on. There are all sorts of, how it affected the local population is really, really appalling. But the thing here, 76 are young hookworm. 70% survive. 70% survive the first year of newborn babies. 50% of them don't make adulthood. That was the state of Borneo, British Borneo at the time. And the education handicap, in 1946, a 16-year-old equated to a 10, 11-year-old, because the Japanese totally changed the education and totally destroyed what was on. We then have the war graves. One is Sandakan, the other one is Batu Lintang, which got the name of Boot Hill, or one of them. And the Australian and British war graves people went round. And when Major Jackson sent his report back to Melbourne, where the army headquarters was, they threw it out and said, you're making it up. He said, no, I am not. And then Labuan. And I felt something had to be done. And so in 27th of August, 2011, Sabbath salute. The guys in the back walked Sandakan Day to Kundasang, to the second camp, arriving on the 25th. On the 27th, we had the service, and unveiled the Royal Artillery Memorial. A few years later, I produced the Roll of Honour, which I presented to the Sabahan government. The CD accepted it. It is now in the museum. And in the Royal Artillery, it was the service of remembrance in London that it was received, over 100 on parade. And finally, that lies in the Royal Artillery Church there. And then the book. And Datuk C.L. Chan, when he saw the folder I gave him, he said, "Big book." Well, it weighs 1.5 kilograms. It's there. And that is my trilogy of remembrance and the history of here and in Borneo. Thank you very much.